difference between people having an understanding of how biblical stories fit together with their own experience or the experience of others that they know, and having a doctrine. Like, isn't a doctrine something more than the way we understand the Bible story? Isn't doctrine more precise, more required, more important than, aren't you all doing something with doctrine that's not just how we go about understanding what Paul or Jesus or Deborah meant when they are quoted saying something in the Bible?
Well, when doctrine is an attempt to understand what you're reading and what it means. Like the eunuch asking Philip, how can I understand this unless someone teaches it to me?
Uh-huh.
Doctrine, the call to understand doctrine, to teach doctrine, to pass doctrine down, to hold on, to contend for the faith, that's replete throughout the Scriptures, so we don't really have a choice here. My concern is that we're living in a time when there's kind of been a division between the story or life on one side and doctrine on the other, when in fact...
Yeah, and I want there to be that divide. Yeah, very much. So tell me why that divide's a problem.
Well, first and foremost, because not only doctrine is clearly presented and tagged as such in the Bible.
Like which ones? Like what in the Bible is tagged as doctrine? What are you thinking of there?
Well, look in your concordance under doctrine.
Yeah, I know. You know, Paul says something to Timothy like contend for the doctrine, but then doesn't say what they are. Just someone interprets that, and other people would interpret it as the teaching as opposed to doctrine. But
he teaches in 1 Corinthians 15. He says of first importance is that Christ was crucified, was buried, rose again on the third day, and was seen by many alive afterwards. That's doctrine.
But how come then? How come that's not like why is that not enough? Right. This is what I'm trying to sort of pull out from you a little bit is how come there has to be this scaffolding of explanation that we all know all of our scaffoldings of explanation at some point are going to come up a little short and are going to have a little bit of, well, now you're going to get somewhere we can't explain all of it and there's some mystery. At what point do you decide that a statement like Jesus was crucified, buried, risen on the third day, and seen for all of us, that's not sufficient, and that rather we need someone 300 years later and 1,700 years later and 1,000, 2,000 years later to give us a more developed explanation of what that means? Like, doesn't that really mean that that's not sufficient in and of itself?
Well, let's just stay with the passage.
Yeah.
Paul has 40 other verses there to unpack that terse sentence, and that's all a part of what he says is the gospel of first importance. And I received this, he says, from the apostolic tradition of the earlier church. You have creedal formulas in the New Testament. You have hymns in the New Testament that are basically sung creeds. You have, I think that there is absolutely no way of getting around the importance that the New Testament places on teaching the doctrine that we find in Scripture. I think you're kind of, if I may.
Go ahead. No, feel free. You have at it. Yeah.
I get the sense that you're confusing here the doctrine that we find in Scripture, which arises out of the story of the Bible, confusing that doctrine that we find in Scripture that we're trying to interpret with the church's interpretation. Now, the church, we don't have any interpretation-free church. The church is always interpreting the Scripture, whether it's the story or the doctrine or the commands or anything else.
That's right.
But what we're trying to interpret, what we're trying to get at, is the doctrine, and that's why in my systematic theology I arranged everything according to reintegrating this fraying fabric of drama, doctrine, doxology, and discipleship, because we have some who have the doctrine without, it's sort of abstracted from the drama, like the four spiritual laws, or we have the drama without the doctrine, or we have either without it giving rise to doxology and discipleship. The scriptures just don't think like our typical Greek minds about this war between.
Yeah, well, and that's what I find interesting, because I know I've had this conversation before another time, and I know that you recognize that the Scripture is speaking in one language, and then we have this other way of organizing where we think in another. But it feels to me like those four D's that you've come up with are like overlaying on the Bible this other way of viewing what's in the Bible. Does it feel that way to you? Because when I hear people represent doctrine, it feels like they're saying, look, the first thing you should do is get your doctrine right, so when you read the Bible, you'll know what to understand. And that it requires a systemization of understanding so that the Bible will make sense to you or to someone else.
Well, I could take the Nicene Creed as an example here, Doug.
Yeah.
I think, there you have the story,
Mm-hmm.
the doctrine that arises out of it. I think it's absolutely vital for young Christians, new Christians, kids growing up in the church to memorize the Nicene Creed. Why? Is that all? And then, they don't need to learn anything else? No. But the great thing about that is that it summarizes the whole story of the Bible, and it shows you what doctrines emerge out of that story. If you don't have the doctrines, then it's just a ripping good yarn that doesn't mean anything.
Oh, yeah. Okay. Well, that's Michael Horton. Michael, I appreciate it so much for your book and your conversation with Roger and your willingness to be on the show and to suggest it. Roger's book is called Against Calvinism, and Michael Horton, who you've been listening to for the last few minutes, his book is called For Calvinism. And if you're into these kinds of conversations, you might want to pick them up and join in the dialogue yourselves. So, Michael, thanks for being on the program today. Good things to you.
Thanks for having me, Doug.
You bet. Thanks a lot. Hey, stick with us, folks. We've got a Right On coming from the streets of Minneapolis here on Doug Pagitt Radio and AM 950. And you can follow all of this if you want to follow this over at DougPagittRadio.com. You can see video and you can follow the podcast and get links to the books and all sorts of stuff over there. So stick with us here. We've got a Right On coming from the streets of Minneapolis and our good friend Will on AM 950 and DougPagittRadio.com.